In the previous two lessons, we introduced some issues related to measurement, specifically reliability and validity, and we also introduced the concept of scale of measurement. In this lesson, we will attempt to show how scale of measurement and instrumentation, or the choice of instrument that is used to capture our quantitative information, are related. Now, as we recall, measurement is simply the process that is used for quantifying or assigning numbers to the traits that we're trying to measure. And these traits could be achievement levels, they could be attitudes, they could be personalities, etc. And within the classroom in particular, and certainly one of the more common traits that is also examined within research is achievement. And so when we begin to talk about the measuring instrument, certainly the use of a test is going to be one of the most commonly used instruments. Now, when we begin to talk about tests, the discussion begins to grow rapidly, because the discussion of tests can open up issues such as teacher-made tests versus standardized tests, criterion referenced versus normed reference, speed versus power test, selection tests, diagnostic tests, individual versus group administered tests. So the discussion of testing is, or would require a very time-consuming discussion, and even when you look at these types of issues, discussion of tests often will also result in a discussion of item types and how to write specific questions, etc. Now, in most cases within the research field and also within the classroom, we tend to work with, as much as possible, existing instruments. And so for that reason, we won't get into a discussion on how to write selected types of questions. However, two of the issues that we will look at, because they do have relevance not only within an instructional setting but also in a research setting, is the teacher-made or non-standardized versus standardized test, and then taking a further view of standardized tests and looking at the norm-referenced test versus criterion referenced. And along the way, we will also examine how the choice of test or the type of test that is used may potentially impact the scale of measurement that our resulting data will conform to. And again, the whole reason for this discussion is simply that the scale of measurement can in turn impact our choice of analysis or tool that we have to use when examining our data. Now, to begin our discussion, we'll start with the non-standardized assessments or the non-standardized instruments. And basically, these are commonly teacher-made or research-developed instruments that are intended to be used just within the one classroom. They're generally going to be developed for a very specific purpose to address very specific content. Likewise, within research, they're intended to be used within that specific study. They're not necessarily intended to be developed and distributed to a larger audience of researchers. These instruments are can be formal, they can be informal, using some of the terminology that we've looked at previously. So, they can include our traditional pencil paper test, things that we would describe as being a post-test within our study. Basically, though, the fact that they are non-standardized also implies that there isn't a preset set of directions or administrative guidelines. When we talk about utilizing instruments within research, if someone is making a comparison between a standardized versus a non-standardized assessment, then keeping in mind the purpose, oftentimes the standardized assessment will be viewed with a little more credibility, and that's why even in an accountability situation, schools have to use the standardized assessments as opposed to course grades, which are generally based more on the non-standardized assessments. Now, as we move from our non-standardized to our standardized assessments, the standardized assessments are going to be those instruments that have a very prescribed administration process. Again, these could be achievement tests, but they could also be things such as personality scales that, again, have a very defined set of administrative or administration guidelines. And part of the reason for having such a clearly defined administrative procedure is so that comparisons can be made among individuals who have taken this, because not only have these types of instruments generally undergone extensive reliability and validity type examination, but because of the standardization of the administration guidelines, then we know that no matter where the student was when the instrument was completed, we know that it was administered in the same exact fashion. And again, the standardized tests, are what allow researchers, but also educators, to begin comparing schools or states. Now, when we begin talking about standardized tests also opens up the discussion of norm-referenced versus criterion-referenced tests. And when we talk about norm-referenced tests, basically we're talking about tests whose scores are based upon an individual's performance relative to other individuals who have taken the test. And when someone refers to a test being normed, then what typically happens is when the test is developed, a norming sample is used, and the test is administered to that particular sample, and then future students who take the test have their performance compared to that norm sample. And norm reference tests often result in scores such as percentiles, or perhaps quartiles or stanines, and these instruments, and the reason for understanding the types of scores that are produced is that percentiles, stanines, quartiles are all going to be examples of ordinal scale information. And therefore, when you're working with ordinal scale, then that will in turn influence the type of analysis that becomes appropriate. Some examples of norm reference tests, things like California Achievement Test, Iowa Test of Basic Skills. Many of the national achievement tests are going to be norm reference tests. Now, by definition, the norm reference test is generally going to provide results that are on an ordinal type scale. For example, percentiles. And percentiles were also examined earlier in the course, but the percentile, if you recall, is simply a place order number. If somebody is said to have scored at the 80th percentile, it simply means that they scored at or above 80% of the norming sample. And so it really doesn't indicate exactly how much better they did than someone else. For example, if another student scored at the 75th percentile, we know that student scored slightly lower than the one at the 80th percentile, but in all actuality, it could have simply been that they missed one question or one more question than the person at the 80th percentile. At the same time, a third person may have scored at the 70th percentile, but that 5 percentile point difference actually was due to perhaps missing 2 additional questions relative to the 75th percentile. So again, going back to what was mentioned earlier about ordinal scale, the percentile and 1 percentile improvement does not always translate into a specific number of questions, and that improvement is not always consistent. So we can't simply define a percentile point as getting X number of questions correct, because it will vary based on where you are within that order. Now, even though norm reference tests will generally end up reporting things like percentiles, it's not uncommon for the score report to also indicate, for example, how many questions they did get correct within each of the subcategories. And so, even though, for example, you might have Iowa Test of Basic Skills results, and while the primary results are reported as a percentile rank, the score report may actually provide information on the actual number of questions correct. So when you use this test, you may actually have the ability to use ordinal data if you use the percentiles, but if you actually want to use the number of questions correct, then you would have the ability then to use an interval ratio scale data, and consequently an analysis that is appropriate for that scale of measurement. Okay? So even though norm reference is inherently ordinal, the score reports may allow you to use an analysis that is appropriate for that interval ratio scale. Now, criterion reference tests, on the other hand, are not focused on how a student performs relative to another student, but examines how a student performs relative to a preset criteria. And these criteria depending on the level of the test, could be something like state curriculum, or it could be something like just simply the lesson plans or the goals for a particular unit. A classroom teacher may have established a set of 10 goals that the students are to meet during the course of a particular lesson. And so the examination is built around the fact that they have to meet these particular goals. And so the results of a criterion reference test may actually be portrayed in terms of the number of criteria that have been met. But one of the common ways to also report this is through the use of proficiency levels, where someone external and who was involved with the development of the instrument, actually determines that an individual with a score of, or an individual who gets a certain number of questions correct is deemed to be at a level of proficiency. If they get a higher number of questions correct, then they get classified as advanced, or they get classified as mastery, or maybe they got fewer questions correct, and so therefore they're approaching proficiency. So even with criterion reference tests that perhaps intuitively might suggest the use of more of an interval ratio type scale, depending on how the scores are reported, the scores could very well still be ordinal in nature. For example, if you were interested in looking at the number of individuals who were approaching proficiency, proficient, advanced, and mastery, then we are effectively working with a ordinal classification. Okay. Now, from an analytical standpoint, if you recall from the scale of measurement discussion, anything that is ordinal also contains all the properties of nominal. So in some cases, and in particular with the proficiency classification example, researchers may actually opt to treat that type of information on a nominal scale. And if so, then again, that will in turn influence the type of analysis that is appropriate. Now, just like with the standardized test, the results of the criterion reference test may very well provide norm-referenced information. It may also provide information on the number of questions that are correct. So when you choose any of the standardized tests, it becomes very important for not only the researcher but the classroom teacher as well to recognize the data that they have elected to use in their analysis and to ultimately use as the basis for their decision, because some of the information may very well be on a scale that they did not anticipate. Now, as far as criterion reference tests, some common examples might be a driver's license test. A lot of state-developed assessments, such as graduation exams, are often criterion-based, in large part because states have adopted certain benchmarks and expectations, and therefore the examinations are built around assessing and determining where the students fall relative to these established performance benchmarks.